In our first lecture, we talked about the sampling related to our test of controls. Now what we want to focus on are the substantive procedures. And again, the substantive procedures are these procedures that we use to measure monetary misstatements within the financial statements. There are specific steps related to sampling, and again, we're looking at account balances and associated assertions. We specify the audit objectives of the test, define a misstatement. We define the population from which the sample is to be taken. We choose the appropriate sampling method, determine the sampling size, select sample items, and perform our substantive procedures, evaluate, and document. In step one is what we're looking at is we're looking at the population. So what is it that we're attempting to do? Well, we're attempting to identify a misstatement. A misstatement is a dollar amount misstatement, either intentional or unintentional, that exists in a transaction or a financial statement account balance. So we talked about transactions in our last lecture. Transactions are where we are focusing on the internal controls, but certainly transactions also relate to account balances. So sales transactions, we're looking at these from a control perspective, but the transactional sales, or the amount that we are reporting as sales, becomes an account balance that we are measuring dollar amount misstatements. This involves identifying the difference between the recorded value and the audited value, and in just a minute we're going to give an example of this. In step one, we identify what are factual or known misstatements, those that have been specifically identified and about which there is no doubt. Projected or likely misstatements, these are based upon our best estimate and is calculated as a sampling interval multiplied by the tainted percentage. Tolerable misstatement and expected misstatement, very similar to what we identified in our last lecture. So let's talk about a specific substantive test of the detail of account balances. Consider the following information about inventory in an account balance of an entity. So what management is identifying, the book value of inventory is $3 million. We identify a sample. That sample is $10,000. So that sample is based upon the book value. Once we audit this, we determine that the actual amount of this $10,000 is in fact not $10,000 but $98,000, and the total amount of overstatement is $2,000. So what we're assuming now is that we did a random sample, and the random sample was done in such a way, a statistical sample, where we can infer from the sample to the entire population. Critical issue, and it's absolutely critical as we determine the misstatement. So what we have here is we have the ratio of misstatement to the sample is 2%, $2,000 divided by $1,000. Because this was an appropriately drawn random sample, we can infer or apply the ratio to the entire population, and this produces a best guess estimate of the inventory of $60,000, or 60,000 of $3 million times 2%. So what we're inferring is that the population is overstated by $60,000. Now we have a number. So what are we going to do with that? Well, the results of our audit test depends upon the tolerable misstatement associated with inventory account. If the tolerable misstatement is $50,000, we cannot conclude that the account is fairly stated because our best estimate of the projected misstatement is greater than the tolerable misstatement. Now, before we go and ask management to change the number, we're certainly going to evaluate the results. Depending upon the significance of it, we may in fact draw a larger sample or a different sample and see if we can confirm this misstatement. Once we've confirmed this, is we do have a misstatement, and what we would want to do with this is work with management in terms of having them restate this number And this may in fact be something, if they refuse to restate, that we would issue a qualified opinion. Let's continue on the steps of what we're attempting to do. So in step 2 is we define the population from which the sample is to be taken. We define the sampling units, the individual auditable elements made up of the account balances. We determine the completeness of the population. This is absolutely critical because if we have a population and it's not complete, then our sample results are not going to be correct. We identify individual significant items. Significant portion of the total value may account for the population, and this may be concentrated in a few large dollar items. So it's very important for us to understand the population. And as we're working with our population, is we want to do some specific steps to this and identify the population based upon dollar value. So we want to look at the top population and determine if there's a sampling interval that exceeds a certain amount. And specifically what we might be doing is stratify the sample. So let's say we have some significantly large accounts, say they're all over $1 million, and then we have a whole bunch of little accounts, let's say they're under $1,000. Well, when we're looking at the population, what we may want to do is do a stratification, dividing the population into 2 or more subgroups so that we can capture elements within each of these populations. A subset of what we're describing here is monetary unit sampling. This is a subset of probability proportion to size, and basically what we're doing here is we are determining the population based upon the dollar value as opposed to the individual items. So if we're using a dollar value in a monetary unit sampling, what we are doing is we are increasing the probability of the larger items to be picked in our sample as compared to the smaller items. So the 2 things that we want to consider is, are we going to use the complete population as a single unit where we identify a sample? Are we going to stratify the population and maybe pick subsamples of 2 or more subgroups? Or are we going to use monetary unit sampling? And again, monetary unit sampling is where we are looking at the dollar value as the total population as opposed to the individual units. Irrespective of the method chosen, consideration must be given to the risk of material misstatement, sampling risk, and the auditor's assessment of the tolerable and expected misstatement. When the total estimate of the misstatement exceeds the tolerable misstatement, the auditor asks the client to correct the factual misstatements, analyzes the misstatement for common problems, determine an alternate strategy for evaluating the results, possibly expanding the sample. We may even change the audit objectives to estimate the correct value. All these related decisions regarding the sampling process should be documented. What we have here is we are developing a strategy in terms of measuring monetary misstatement. And once we've identified the monetary misstatement, that's not the end of the process. This is something that we want to expand on in terms of developing alternative strategies, additional testing, or ultimately asking the client to correct the factual misstatement. And in fact, this is where if the management refuses to correct this factual misstatement, we would be issuing a qualified opinion as opposed to an unqualified opinion. Okay, so I thank you very much for your time.